everyone, and welcome to Final Fridays with the John Ritter Foundation. My name is Ellen Hostetler. I'm the Chief Science Officer for the Foundation, and I am very excited today because we have a session that a lot of you have been asking for. We've had so many questions, so I think we're going to get some really good information from our expert today. So just a quick housekeeping note, this is recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel and also on our website, so you can share it later with family or friends who may not have been able to attend live. You can ask questions in the chat on the right hand of the screen. Please remember to be kind to your fellow attendees, and also try not to share medical advice or any of these other things that we've talked about before. And other than that, if you're having any issues with your sound, typically if you just reload the browser, it should work. So I suggest doing that, but we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, I'm very excited for today's speaker. She is someone I was lucky enough to work with in my old position and is an extremely experienced genetic counselor. So we have joining us today Andrea Rideout, and she is a certified genetic counselor with the Maritime Medical Genetics Service. I'm going to read her bio because she's done so much, so I don't want to forget anything. She received her Master's of Science degree in genetic counseling from Sarah Lawrence College. Following this, she's held positions in prenatal and psychiatric genetics research and primary care education in New York and Toronto. She returned to Halifax in 2007 to work with the Atlantic Medical Genetics and Genomic Initiative, a gene discovery project at Dalhousie University in the IWK Health Center. And in 2008, she joined the Maritime Medical Genetics Service at the IWK Health Center as a clinical genetic counselor. Currently, her focus is on connective tissue disorders, inherited cardiac disease, and 22q11 deletion syndrome. So she is one of the most experienced genetic counselors I've had the pleasure of working with, and has a great presentation today. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Andrea.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. And thanks for everyone logging in. It's Friday afternoon where I'm physically located, so thanks for joining. Just turn on my slides, go. There we go. Yes, no? There we go. Okay. So I'm here today just to give you an overview about what genetic counseling entails and genetic testing for diseases related to orthopathy. So orthopathy is a word that we use to apply for either a widening of the aorta or the main blood vessel coming from the heart. It may also be called an aneurysm, and when that bursts, that's called a dissection. So orthopathy to describe all of that. There we go. So there's an overlay on my slides. I don't know why that is, or if I can even remove it, but anyhow, I just
we can just see your slide perfectly. Okay. It looks great on our end.
Looks weird on my end, but that's okay. So so I'm a genetic counselor in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. So that's northeast of Maine. We have a huge genetics department. We have 6 docs and probably about 18 genetic counselors, and we could easily double our staff. Because genetics is so vast, we're all subspecialized. So I am on a smaller team of people specializing in connective tissue disorders, 2 medical geneticists, Dr. Anthony Vanderstein and Sandhya Parkash. And there's 2 other genetic counselors, Sarah McKay and Kelly Turner. I've been a genetic counselor for 20 years. That's another way to say I'm old. And I've been doing connective tissue and orthopathy disorders for probably about 15 years. My Master's of Science is from New York, and I did actually work in the States before returning home. I am certified in both Canada and the US, and my experience spans clinical research and education. I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. So I took this outline from your questions that Ellen had forwarded me. So I will explain what a genetic counselor is, talk about some various risk factors for orthopathy, benefits of a genetics assessment, what's involved in genetic testing, what the implications means. I'll address some myths, and we left lots of time for your questions. Or at least I hope we left lots of time. So what is a genetic counselor? So I guess the first thing to explain is we are not physicians. We're under the umbrella of allied healthcare providers. We all have at least a master's degree in either human genetics or genetic counseling. Some genetic counselors have PhDs. Each country has their own certification. So I'm talking mostly about first world countries. And in the United States, there's licensure on a state-by-state basis, and it may not be for every single state. But if you're looking for a genetic counselor, you want to make sure they're certified, and if there's licensure in that state, that they're licensed. That way you know you're getting information from someone who's experienced. The other primarily things we do are risk assessments. So we collect your family history, your medical history, and we decide like what testing is appropriate for your situation. One of the big chunk of time we spend is choosing a laboratory that's accredited for medical testing, and it's the right test. We also do a lot of education for people in families with genetic disease. We provide some psychosocial support around decision making and coping with disease. And sometimes when we do an assessment, we realize that you may need to have other people involved in your care and not just us. So this is a picture, an old picture actually, of about a quarter of the people in my department. So in this picture, there's a mixture of admin staff, dietitian, nursing, physicians, and a whole bunch of genetic counselors. So if you have orthopathy, in an ideal world, which we don't live in, your team should consist of a genetics person, a cardiologist, and a surgeon. So who's the right person to do what? So you want your surgery done by someone who's a surgeon. And so their job is to have a look at your imaging studies, decide what your aorta looks like, how big can it grow before they need to fix it, and if they're going to fix it, what is the best surgical procedure. So here, our surgeons don't really follow people, but that may differ depending on the hospital. Here, our orthopathy patients are followed by a cardiologist that's not a surgeon, so their job is to diagnose aneurysms, manage high blood pressure, and provide ongoing screening. We have medical geneticists involved in our department to do syndromic assessments. And our genetic counselors, we do risk assessment by collecting family history, medical history, organizing testing. So most cardiologists and surgeons don't have any medical training in genetics. There are rare people that are cross-trained, but as a general rule of thumb, they didn't take genetics in medical school. And I would say probably about, if anyone graduated more than 5 years ago, their medical training may have consisted of a couple hours of genetics, not much more, depending on the school. So it's kind of like, do you want a genetic counselor who's never done surgery to do your surgery, or do you want your surgeon to do your genetic test results? So I want a surgeon for my stuff and not a genetic counselor doing cross stitch on my aorta. We craft a lot in our department, so. All right, so I think most of you are familiar with this. I stole this picture from the John Ritter Foundation website. So we have the normal blood vessel. I just remembered you can't see the mouse. And then the blood vessel on my right. You can tell the blood vessel is wider compared to the normal one. That's what we call a dilation or an aneurysm. So non-genetic risk factors for this include high blood pressure, especially uncontrolled or untreated, hardening of the arteries or blockages, which are called atherosclerosis, smoking. Older you get, the more likely this is to happen. Structural changes in the heart, notably a change in the aortic valve called the bicuspid aortic valve. Untreated infections, mostly syphilis. And other things, if you are a competitive athlete, like a competitive weightlifter, do a lot of competitive sports, a professional singer, particularly like opera, or you play a lot of wind instruments, all these things can actually put more stress on your aorta. Other risk factors include family history, like do you have someone else in the family with one of these conditions, or genetic diseases. So there's a misconception that if you have high blood pressure, you don't have a genetic disease causing your orthopathy. You can have uncontrolled high blood pressure and any one of these genetic errors working together to cause a dissection. How genetics assessments work, there's different models of care depending on what institution you go to. So prior to an appointment, typically a genetic counselor would collect your medical history records, like your imaging studies of your aorta, maybe some family members, and genetic test results if you've had them done prior to seeing us. Then during the appointment, we're going to fill in the blanks of your family medical history and come up with a risk assessment. How likely is it for you to have a gene error causing the orthopathy disease in your family? So the general rule of thumb is if there are 2 relatives with orthopathy, you're about a 20% chance of finding something. We also go over during an in-person or a Zoom meeting, discussion of the risks and benefits of genetic testing, what the implications mean for you, your medical care, your family. We try to work through some expected and unexpected emotional reactions and support decision making. And then after the appointment, you should get either a phone call or an appointment in person to discuss your genetic test results, the implications, changes to medical management, and then you should get a written summary that goes to you and your physician. And we also have medical support or psychological support as well. So some of the benefits of having genetic testing done through a genetics professional is we're not just focusing on one area of medicine. So a heart doctor is focused solely on the heart because that's what their training is. We try and take in the big picture. Like, do you have other features of a connective tissue disorder, like a curve in your spine, like bony changes, skin issues, and so on? So the reason why we're looking at everything is we don't want to miss a very rare cause of orthopathy disease. We also need to determine who is the best person in the family to test, and that can affect how informative the test results are, making sure the laboratory is certified, the correct testing is ordered. So in collecting records in the States, I have seen people be charged for a full panel of genetic testing, so over $1,000, when they needed just testing for the familial genetic error, which is about $200, so huge difference in price. And we need to interpret the results in the context of your own family and medical history. So this is a common scenario. So Jane's uncle, Thomas, died of a dissection at 49, and nobody else in the family has had any screening for aneurysms. So Jane, like everyone, Googled this, and Google said, yeah, this is genetic. I hate Google sometimes. Anyhow, so here in Nova Scotia and in many other Canadian provinces, we have a collaboration with the medical examiner. So for sudden cardiac death cases, our medical examiner does save a sample from the deceased for genetic testing. That varies from place to place. So if there's no medical examiner sample available for testing, what do you do from here? So the best thing to do is to actually start by having everyone screened for aneurysms. If one of Thomas's parents has an aneurysm, then they would be the best person to test. So if we just test Jane, if she has a normal genetic test result and no aneurysm, we don't know if there's a gene in the family that she did not inherit, and we don't know if the family could have an inherited predisposition that's not detected by genetic testing. So while it may sound reassuring, it's not really answering the question of why did this happen to her uncle. So here's another example. So we have the same family tree, but we have someone who's passed away of a dissection and we don't know anything out about the rest of the family. So this is loosely based on a family that we published. So after everyone has screening, we have Jane, who died in the postpartum period of an aortic dissection at a young age, 19. We went on to screen her family members. So Jane's mom had a normal SX means screening, as did one of her aunts, but her aunt and her uncle didn't, and neither did her grandmother. So if there was no sample to test from Jane with family screening, we know that Mary, Sarah, or Thomas would be an appropriate candidate. And so I should have said actually at the beginning, in these family trees, squares are men, circles are women, and a diagonal line means someone has passed away. Numbers mean 2 or 4 people. So hopefully that's clear. Yeah, so once we decide you qualify for genetic testing, we need to tell you exactly what's going to happen. So most genetic testing is done through a blood sample, no fasting needed. Some labs do accept saliva samples. So genetic information has many different names. DNA is probably the most encompassing. So all of our genetic information comes in pairs of two, or I should say most of it comes in pairs of two, one bit of information from mom and one bit from dad. So your bits of information are divided into genes. Each gene is supposed to give you or tell your body a specific set of instructions. So you can think of instructions for hair color, eye color, and so on. So when we do genetic testing, we take the DNA out of your blood cells, your saliva, and then we zone in on the specific gene. So you can think of your genetic information, if you're old enough, as a volume of encyclopedias. A chromosome would be one book, one volume in the set of encyclopedias. And then a gene would be one chapter, and genetic testing is looking for one spelling mistake in that chapter. So when we do genetic testing, we're comparing the person being tested to the reference sample. You can also think of the reference sample about a dictionary and us looking for a spelling error. So this is one of the tests where I say the devil's in the details. The results are complex. It's not super straightforward. TV overstates that. So there's three types of test results for medical testing: normal, which we also call uninformative; disease causing, the medical term for that is pathogenic or likely pathogenic; and the third result essentially means we don't know. So that's a variant of unknown genetic significance. And the types of test results you can get depend on what type of testing you had. Did you have medical testing? The most common method for that is next generation sequencing. Did you go through direct to consumer testing, or DTC? That is GWAS study, which I'll explain. That's not medical testing. Research testing can be a combination of methods, and that's also not considered medical testing. So when we think about results, it's helpful to think about normal variation in the population. So I stole this slide from my colleagues in Alberta, but if you look at the people in this slide, no one's sick. They all have differences in hair color, eye color, skin tone, and none of those differences are disease causing. They're just part of normal variations in our genes for like height, eye color, skin color, and so on. I don't know if there's any famous people in here, but the second row has Buffy St. Marie. She's a famous Canadian Indigenous singer. So props to Buffy. So our easiest, or one of our easier test results to work with, is normal. So this means the laboratory looked at the spelling of the person being tested. They didn't find any errors in the gene. So we don't have a genetic explanation for the orthopathy, and we call that uninformative. So if you have a normal genetic test result that's more than 2 to 5 years old, there may have been new genes discovered. So it's worth checking back to see what was tested and what may be available. Because we don't have a genetic explanation for the orthopathy, we go back to your family history. So all first-degree relatives should have ongoing screening for orthopathy, and more genetic testing in the family is probably not going to be helpful. Because if we tested the best person and they don't have anything, it's unlikely we'll find something else in someone else, or another family member, I should say. So even though the test is normal, it doesn't mean the aneurysms in the family aren't inherited. It is possible, even with all of our greatest test methods today, we can still miss variants in parts of the gene that are difficult to analyze. People can have errors in genes that either weren't tested for or genes that are yet to be discovered. Sometimes people get normal test results because a wrong test was ordered, or you didn't test sort of the best person in the family. So when I say the correct test was ordered, I'm just going to tell two quick examples from our clinic. So both of these families were seen by other people and given incorrect diagnosis before they came to genetics. So we had one family who had features of classic Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but the genetic basis of those features was not typical. And it was in a gene that actually had a 20% risk for vascular disease or orthopathy, which is typically not part of classic Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. The other is a very rare syndrome called Grange syndrome, which can affect your blood vessels as well, and it has other features aside from orthopathy associated with it. So that is one of the benefits of a genetics assessment, not missing these finer details. So our second test result is what we call pathogenic. So it means we found a genetic variant that is disease causing. So in order to classify a change in a gene as disease causing, we need to have a level of evidence that's at least 90% certain that it's the error. So we collect that evidence from functional studies of this specific gene mutation, other people who have the same gene variant or mutation, and large databases from around the world. If you reach 95% level of evidence or greater, then it goes from likely pathogenic to pathogenic. So I always think of this as a good result because we found the genetic explanation for the orthopathy, and we can use this information to offer genetic testing to other family members to see who's at risk and save their lives through screening and repair of aneurysms. You can also use the information for prenatal diagnosis or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And then for people where there's a known genetic mutation or variant in the family that don't want testing, they should just have ongoing screening. So I feel like social media and TV oversells genetics in the sense that if you inherit one of these disease-causing mutations, it doesn't always tell us, it's not a crystal ball. So we can tell you're at higher risk, but we can't tell you when you will develop a problem or if you will for certain. So other things, other benefits of a positive test result, some of the orthopathy genes have other health problems associated with them. So for example, Marfan Syndrome or FBN1, you need screening for your eyes because the lens of the eye can dislocate or detach, which could cause blindness. For Loeys-Dietz, there's a risk for early onset osteoporosis, which you would need screening and management through your family doc for. For ACTA2, there's also risk for early onset stroke and coronary artery disease, maybe as high as 25 to 30% for some families. And vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or collagen 3A1, tissues are very fragile, so we recommend no invasive procedures unless they're life-saving. And there's all kinds of other examples. And also the result will give information to your cardiologist and surgeon about surgical planning, how big can your aneurysm get before it should be repaired, and so on. So the test result is incredibly unsatisfying for healthcare providers and confusing for patients is a gene change that we found, and we don't have enough information to know if this gene variant is disease causing or if it's a normal difference between people. So our first goal in medicine is to do no harm. So if we're not certain that that variant causes disease, we're not going to use it for medical management. So we go back to recommending management based on family history. Excuse me. So that means screening of first degree relatives, parents, siblings, and children. And generally, we wouldn't offer genetic testing to other family members for this because it's not going to help medical management. The good news about these results is with online collaboration and databases and people all around the world chatting, we'll likely have new information about the variant in about 2 years, maybe 5. Okay, so most of these conditions are inherited in what we call a dominant fashion. So in this picture, we have a red and a blue parent. The red parent has I guess a white gene that's working correctly and a dark gene that's not. So when we have children, we only pass on 1 of our 2 copies of each of our genes, and it's at random. We don't have any control over it. So the child that inherits 1 working gene from the blue parent and 1 working gene from the red parent won't have orthopathy. This doesn't skip a generation, so if you don't inherit it, you can't pass it on to your children. The other option is the child inherits the non-working gene from the red parent, and they're at higher risk for orthopathy, and they should have screening. And it's important to remember that the risk is independent with each pregnancy. So if you have 2 children, it doesn't mean one will get it and one don't. Both could not inherit it, both could inherit it, or some combination. For certain orthopathy conditions like Marfan syndrome and Loeys-Dietz, about a quarter to a third of the people who have it will be the first person in the family to have it. So in this picture, mom and dad don't have the genetic error, and it's just 1 person in the family. So what happened was there was an error at the time of conception in the gene that started in that 1 person in the family. Those errors occur normally in nature. There's nothing you can do to cause or prevent it. And if you are the first person in the family to have it, you can pass it on to your children, but your brothers and sisters are not at risk. So one of the concepts about inheritance that can be difficult is something called reduced penetrance. So this means that not everyone who inherits the gene variant or disease-causing variant will necessarily develop orthopathy. They can pass the variant on to their children, who may or may not develop disease. There can be some differences perhaps in the expression of that gene error between men and women. So we have some data that, at least the paper I think is in Press, that men for certain gene errors may be more likely to have a dissection compared to women. I don't know if that's going to apply to every single gene that causes orthopathy, but certainly for the one that was studied by my colleagues. The results can't tell us for certain if someone's going to develop orthopathy, when or what age they will need surgery, or how severe the disease may be. So for example, with Marfan syndrome, you can have some people in the family that meet every checkbox. They're tall, they're thin, they have a curve in their spine, they have orthopathy, and they might have a sibling that just has orthopathy and no external features of Marfan syndrome. So this doesn't skip a generation. Dominant genes may look like they skipped a generation because somebody may not develop an aneurysm. So if someone doesn't have it, their children don't have to worry about it, and they don't need cardiac screening for it. Okay, so our next kind of group of testing is something we call direct-to-consumer testing. So direct-to-consumer testing is not ordered by a healthcare provider. You don't need a healthcare provider's signature to order it. So direct-to-consumer testing actually cannot be used for medical management. And there's many reasons for this. One is the typical test method used, which is called GWAS, or Genome-Wide Association Studies, which I'll explain in a minute. And the laboratory may not be accredited for medical testing. So accreditation means that you're going to have skilled, licensed, trained, experienced people doing your testing. You have protocols in place to ensure there's no sample mix-up. Your results are standardized and conform to acceptable standards of interpreting a variant. Like, is it a VOS? Is it disease-causing? So we have many, many horror stories in the genetics clinic about people doing direct-to-consumer testing and unfortunately not being educated about what it can and cannot tell you. So one very sad example was published in the New York Times on April 16, 2019. So they had a group of about 100 women or so that had direct-to-consumer testing. Some of it was through 23andMe, some of it was through other direct-to-consumer testing. And the bottom line was about 40 to 50% of them, their test results were incorrect. So it was for breast cancer. So some women discontinued screening. Then when their testing was redone through a medical lab, they actually had a mutation that was not detected by direct-to-consumer testing. Other women were told they had a mutation through direct-to-consumer testing, which was incorrect, and they had their breasts removed unnecessarily. So lots of pitfalls there. So medical testing, I use the analogy of looking for a spelling mistake in a gene. So that is not what direct-to-consumer testing does. So for medical testing, I'm going to use the analogy of an address. So I've chosen the address for the hospital that I work at. So if I did medical testing looking for the IWK orthopathy, so I've made up my own disease, you should get the name of the gene, disease, an address, a city, a province or state, postal or zip code, and a country. So a medical test result for the hospital where I work at would be the gene is called IWK. The specific variant or change in the gene would be the address of 5850. This means one base pair was deleted from the gene, and give you a disease. So I'm just naming this IWK-related orthopathy. If I asked the same question for direct-to-consumer testing, it will tell me the IWK gene is located somewhere in the city of Halifax in the province of Nova Scotia in Canada. It's not giving me an exact change. So the ironic thing about this result is all of us have the same genes. It's just whether or not there's an error in them. So it's telling you have an IWK gene, which is not helpful because everyone has 2 genes. What we want to know is there an error in that gene? And so direct-to-consumer testing most often uses an association study, which doesn't usually give you that information. Some direct-to-consumer testing look for specific mutations, but not the whole gene. So the classic example is breast cancer. If you're Ashkenazi Jewish, there's 3 common mutations, but if you're not Ashkenazi Jewish, you need to look at the whole gene and not those 3 specific common ones. So it's the whole gene part that could be missing. So some people aren't good with verbal explanations, so I did a picture. So if you go into Google Maps and you type in the IWK hospital, so this is great. You put this into your GPS 5850 University Avenue, boom, you get to where you're going. If you did the same analogy with a GWAS study, it would just tell you where Halifax is and not how to find the hospital. Mind you, we're not that big of a city and everyone's super friendly. So you could find the hospital here easily, but I wouldn't say that that would be true of like some place like Toronto or Montreal. Okay, so some things to keep in mind about genetic testing. Was the right test ordered for my situation? How long ago was my testing done? Are there new genes available? If you had a genetic variant of unknown significance, keep in touch with your healthcare providers to find out if there's new information available. If you didn't find a gene, you can participate in research looking for genes. And I forgot to add, so research testing typically also does not occur in medically accredited labs, so it's not a substitution for medical testing. Any research result we get, even if it's from an excellent researcher in lab, we always confirm on a separate clinical sample to ensure the results are correct. That is standard of care here. Other things to think about, is there anything unique about you and your family? So because I live in a region of the world that is not so populated, until the pandemic had very few people moving here or leaving, I can get your family's last name and location and probably tell you every genetic condition in that county. So for example, we know there's a founder effect for certain orthopathy genes in one region of where I work. So that's referred to as a founder population. If your parents are related, then we might have to think of more rare genetic causes where each parent has 1 gene error is healthy, but when you get 2 gene errors, it causes a problem. So we might have to rethink stuff. And is there something unusual about your medical history that suggests you should have assessment for a rare genetic syndrome? So these are all things to keep in mind with test results. Ellen had asked me to address some common myths. So every statement on this slide is incorrect. So normal genetic test results means that the orthopathy disease in my family is not genetic. That is incorrect. It could still be genetic. My dissection was caused by high blood pressure, so genetic testing is not helpful. That is also incorrect. You can have both high blood pressure and a gene error or a pathogenic variant. Only men have aortic dissections. Certainly in some families it would appear that way, but women are still at risk and women can still dissect, particularly during pregnancy and postpartum. And every genetic variant is disease causing. So that's not true. Go back to my slide of pictures of people from around the world. They all look different, and those are all caused by gene differences, but they don't cause disease. And to remember that direct consumer testing and research testing is not a substitute for medical testing. So hopefully that's most of the myths. So I'm ready for questions. This is a picture of my dog, Joe, and this is just to say no matter what health problems you have, hopefully there's a way to overcome. Or if you're Joe, you got adopted by someone who bought you a wheelchair. So one or the other.
Joe is giving me everything right now. I love Joe. I wish I was there to pet the good boy. Thank you so much for that. You really addressed, I think, all the questions that I asked you to. So So wonderful job. Definitely was helpful for me to hear, especially some of the wind instruments. I had never heard that before. So that was a new risk factor that I had never heard of. One thing I wanted to say, we had a few questions about the John Ritter research program in the chat. Since Andrea doesn't work for them, I thought I would address them because I used to, at least. And we have some folks who do currently work for them in the chat answering questions. But this is complicated, but the John Ritter Foundation is actually different from the John Ritter Research Program. So we fund and support our partners at the research program, but we're separate entities. They work out of the University of Texas in Houston with Dr. Milowitz as their lab leader. And that research program is really trying to do scientific discovery. They're trying to find new genes, novel genes that have yet to be identified as being able to cause aortic dissection. So it's different from what Andrea was talking about with clinical testing, where you're trying to get a diagnosis as a patient or to know if you personally are at increased risk. One is really, your medical care, and the other is greater scientific knowledge and discovery that will hopefully help the wider community of people with aortic aneurysms and dissections. So if you're participating in research, we thank you so much. You are definitely helping others. However, we still recommend that you seek out clinical genetic testing separate from participating in the research program, because really the program is not offering that. They're not doing clinical testing. They're not a CLIA certified lab like Andrea was talking about. It's a research lab. So we are happy to help you find a way to do that. I'm going to put out a handout that you can download. You can find it on our website, how to access genetic testing. If there are any Canadians listening, I'm afraid most of this is targeted towards our US-based patients, so I apologize for that. We will hopefully develop more international resources in the future, but I'm going to put up the handout for that. And you can always email the research team directly to talk about these details more. I'll ask them to put their email address in the chat. So that's my little disclaimer there. And I think that we have some questions actually okay, they've put up the genetic testing information link, and that'll lead you to a few directories where you can search for a genetic counselor who's licensed and certified, or a clinic to see you, or some telehealth options as well. Okay, so this is a great question to clarify. I think some people, when they get the negative testing result, or, oh, your genetics is all clear, they think that to mean, there's no possibility I have a genetic condition, which you did address. If you get that negative result, they don't find anything. Does your family still need imaging? Your brothers, your sisters, or your kids, for example.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. Even though we might not have found a gene, it doesn't mean that aneurysm isn't genetic in nature. There are parts of the gene we can't easily analyze by the current technology, and it doesn't mean that your family doesn't have a gene that wasn't tested for or not yet discovered. So, for example, if there are two family members with aortic orthopathy or aortic disease, the chance to find an inherited cause is about 20%. So that means the other 80% are unknown. Sometimes families can have common environmental risk factors, but yeah, your relatives still need to be screened. If there is a normal genetic test result, they still need to have cardiac imaging.
There's quite a good example of this in the chat. Someone mentioned they have a pathogenic ACT2 variant, which is one of the genes that's associated with aortic disease. But we only discovered this as a cause of it in 2010, I think about. Yes. So if you had genetic testing in 2009, it would have said, we don't have any findings for you because we didn't know about it yet. So even though, later, of course, we learned about this gene, and that's going to happen in the future, right? We haven't finished finding all the genes yet.
Yeah. I see David has a question about research participation. So one of the differences between medical testing is the lab has to give you a turnaround time for the time that they receive a sample to the time you can expect results. That's not the case with research. Oftentimes they get to it when they can, and there may not be a specific time frame. It's also one of the reasons why we're recommending medical testing as a first line before heading to research. And I also noted that someone said they had a AAA, so that's an abdominal aortic aneurysm. Those are a different animal from aneurysms in the thorax or the chest, so we don't always do testing, at least in our clinic, for AAAs.
That's a really good point about the time it takes in research. I used to tell people, we have people who have participated for over 20 years and we've yet to solve their family's genetic problem. And that's because it's really hard. We're definitely trying. There are people who are spending their whole lives trying to figure these out, but it's very difficult. And at least for the John Ritter research program, they do not report negative results or normal results. And this is because they're not a clinical laboratory. So this is why it's really important to still do clinical testing, even if you're in a research study, unless your research study is offering clinical testing as part of, which I'm not familiar with this Yale New Haven one, so I'm not sure if that's
neither am I.
The case. Okay. Someone asked about, they had rheumatic fever as a child. So should they still have genetic testing if that may have caused their dissection? I haven't heard of rheumatic fever ever causing a dissection of valve disease, but I'm not saying it never happens.
I'm not saying it never happens either. I'm just wondering what type of valve disease it was, and if the rheumatic fever caused the valve disease, and then the valve disease could have led to the aneurysm. That's also a possibility. But typically, rheumatic fever is not an infection that I would associate with an aortic aneurysm or dissection.
So definitely worth exploring genetic testing if you see the person who is in that position. Okay. Male first, I can put this on the screen actually. That way we can both see it. We had a male first cousin dive dissection. Don't know if he had a bicuspid valve. I have an aneurysm plus bicuspid valve. What test should be ordered for me? Yeah. So it sounds like they have aortic disease and they have a first cousin. So definitely some family history.
Yeah. So we, in our clinic, we call that BAV related orthopathy or bicuspid aortic valve. So this is a great example where research participation is good. You should have genetic testing in that situation. It's definitely appropriate. We have a very low pickup rate for these bicuspid aortic valve orthopathy in our clinic. So we know that for some families, a bicuspid aortic valve is super common. Maybe 1 in 100 to 1 in 50 people will have it, but not everyone that has a bicuspid aortic valve has a family history of aneurysms. So we know there is some genetic predisposition to bicuspid valve, and if you have that, it increases your risk for an ascending aortic aneurysm, which can dissect. So in those families, there seems to be a dominant predisposition to aneurysms alone, bicuspid aortic valve alone, or both. And sometimes that whole situation can skip a generation. So it has reduced penetrance. And we haven't really sorted out one genetic explanation for that yet. So clinical testing would be appropriate. And if nothing is found, I would highly suggest enrolling in research studies if you could.
Got it. I believe Dr. Prakash, who did a previous webinar with you, has ongoing study into the genetics of bicuspid aortic valve. So you can Google that if you're so inclined. Finish answering. Let's see, let's put this one up here. Okay, so let's see. So her previous doctor ordered genetic testing. When the results come in, he will forward to me. Will this be something I can understand as a non-medical person?
Probably not. So in the US, there is an association called the National Association of Genetic Counselors. I think the website is nsgc.org, but if you Google that, there's a link to find a genetic counselor, and they have an option for genetic counselors that offer in-person appointments. So if there's none in your state, which I would find surprising actually, in-person appointment is out, but you could see a virtual genetic counselor to review your results. There are a couple private companies that offer remote genetic counseling services as well. The names of which escape me at the moment because they're all in the US or not in Canada.
I think there's one called Genome Medical. And I think, I don't know what lab this woman was tested through,
Yeah.
but sometimes there'll be a number on the report that you can call and talk to one of their genetic
Yeah.
counselors. So that may be a resource too.
Yeah.
But the link that we have on the screen now links to our
There you go.
website, which has the NSGC directory and the American College of Genetic Counseling. So you don't have to Google, you can just click that link if you want to find.
If you're in Canada, the Canadian Association of Genetic Counselors has a similar instrument to find a genetic counselor. For anyone who's in Canada, if you live rural, like if you're up north, or if you're in the Maritimes where I'm located, our genetic service actually covers all 3 maritime provinces, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI. And we have coverage for the whole country. It's just trying to sort out if you're someplace remote, who covers you is fine. You just email any counselor that's close to you and they'll tell you how to get seen.
Okay. All right, what else do we have here? All right, we answered that one, okay, I'm going to my list then. I think the live ones are done, but I'm going to my pre-submitted list. My husband had a dissection recently, so very sorry to hear that. He's still in the hospital. How do I go about getting my children tested for Marfan syndrome? And I'm not sure if this means that their husband has already been diagnosed for Marfan syndrome, or they're just making an assumption on that based on.
So in the ideal world, and I know there's many differences between the healthcare system in Canada and the US. So in Canada, our approach would be to meet with your husband and to initiate genetic testing in him and then assess the children. So if your husband was found to have a genetic reason for his dissection, the children could have a blood test for that condition, or if nothing actionable, like medically actionable, was found, then we would recommend ongoing screening for the children. For people who may be in a situation when their loved one has died of a dissection and they're worried about their descendants, you can never go wrong with cardiac screening. So regular screening for aneurysms, because we know they develop over time. So even if you were checked as a child, it doesn't mean there's no risk as an adult.
That's a very good point, because I got a private email before this, and someone asked me, I had imaging, it sounded like a sibling maybe had a dissection, and they told me I was good. Does that mean I'm good forever?
No, no.
Okay.
There are different medical opinions about how often you should have screening. The ballpark would be repeat the screening every 5 to 10 years, depending on the situation. If it was someone who was quite young that died, so quite young, say like under 45, you might want to do more frequent screening. If it was an older person, maybe less frequent. You can discuss that with a cardiologist who's looking after you, because part of that decision making will be up to them. But a one-time check is not the way to go for sure.
Okay. And this, you may have just addressed this, but I saw maybe you saw that and that's why you said that.
Oh no, I didn't actually.
Fatal. Yeah. So depending, at least I can speak to the US component. I assume that's where this person's from. So apologies if you're actually Canadian, but in the US, if they had an autopsy, most medical examiners will save a blood sample for a certain number of years. It varies by district, how much storage space they have, all sorts of things. But I've been able to request blood samples from a medical examiner going back, honestly, 30 years at one point,
wow.
maybe even more. It was in the 80s once I got a sample successfully. So it's worth, if your sibling had an autopsy, it's definitely worth figuring out the medical examiner and seeing if they have a sample. Not all samples can be used for genetic testing. There are certain requirements about the quality and the type, how it's been stored, these things, but a lot of times they can successfully do testing on that sample still. So definitely worth pursuing. Otherwise, if there's no one available to test that's living, sometimes based on your own history, they may recommend that you're tested, even though it's not the ideal case.
And this isn't something you need to try and navigate yourself. Like, seek out a referral to a genetics professional in your area, and they can help you navigate the system. Because chances
Yes.
are, if your medical examiner is saving samples, they should probably know how to access those and save you a lot of legwork. That's what we're
Yeah,
here for.
absolutely. Yeah, you shouldn't
Yep.
have to be the one tracking down and asking what
Yep.
type of tube the blood was saved in a
Yeah,
genetic counselor.
exactly. And then also speak to your family doctor about cardiac screening if you haven't had it. And like you said, referral to a genetic counselor or medical genetics clinic too can also work.
Awesome. Okay, so this is similar to the question we answered before, but what testing would you recommend for my 14-year-old son? His father had a type A at 32. This is pretty similar to the Marfan question, but since it just seems like generic, they haven't done any testing yet. Maybe you can just reiterate the same idea.
Yeah. So again, our ideal situation is to test the person that had the dissection, because they would be the best person to test because they have the most severe manifestation of the condition. And again, if that's not possible, if they're deceased, connect with a local genetics clinic to see if they have connection with a medical examiner or coroner to check for old samples. If not, if all that you have to go on is the family history, then your child should be referred to a cardiologist for testing and for ongoing screening and testing for aneurysms. In some situations, people will offer, in the States, less so in Canada, but people may offer genetic testing. But even a normal result doesn't rule out that there's no risk for aneurysms. We would still recommend ongoing screening.
Yeah, if I could say one myth that I hear the most, it would be my results were normal, so it's not genetic.
Yeah, no, that's not true.
Over and over again.
Yeah,
even if you have high blood pressure, even if you were pregnant, even if you have high cholesterol, it's a myth that needs to be squashed. Okay.
Yeah. And I would say our highest detection rate for genetic errors are for women who've had aortic aneurysms or dissections during pregnancy. We almost always find something. So,
yeah. And to that note, there is a specific study on women who have had what we call peripartum, so within a year of pregnancy and delivery, dissection. So if you have one of those, please contact our research team, because we really want to learn how to prevent those events in pregnant folks.
And then if you embark on another pregnancy, please ensure you're being followed by a high-risk maternal fetal medicine specialist and a cardiology, please, because we don't want anything else to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. My father had a peripheral artery disease, which led to eventual abdominal aneurysm. I have ascending. Should I get genetic testing?
Yes. Anyone who has an ascending aortic aneurysm definitely qualifies for genetic testing. It could be that your father's peripheral artery disease and abdominal aneurysm are unrelated to your ascending aortic aneurysm, or it could be part of a larger picture. It's really hard to know without more information. So it definitely warrants an assessment.
Let's see. I had a descending aortic dissection several years ago and wonder if my dissection means nieces and nephews are at greater risk. Both my brothers have cardiac disease.
Yeah. I'm assuming if your brothers have cardiac disease, they're being screened, but depending on the type of cardiac disease screening, they may not have been checked for aneurysms. They might have just had an EKG. So that's a test with the stickers on the chest to check your heart rhythm. And one of the genes ACTA2 causes atherosclerosis, or blockage of the arteries, and also dissections. So it's worth having either yourself tested or having the other family members screened.
You definitely covered this, but there's a general question about variants of uncertain significance. Yes, everyone's bane of existence. And I know, and you were very clear, which I definitely appreciate, how we can't use these for medical management because we just don't know yet. and it's one of the realities, unfortunately, the more you test, the more you find, right? But I'm wondering if you could just talk about maybe how these might change in the future, like the class, how do things move from one category to other? Is there a chance in the future we'll know more? Hopefully, yes.
So it depends on how keen the center is where you are. So there are certain types of genetic variants. They're called splice site. Those our clinic will do a skin biopsy on and send them to another lab for functional studies to see if your specific variant of unknown significance changes the instructions in the gene, and they can do that through something called mRNA studies. So certain variants we can easily sort out whether they're disease causing or not, but the type of error in the gene. Unfortunately, splice site ones are the least common variants we get. The most common would be a missense mutation. So part of getting a variant of unknown significance from a genetic counselor's point of view is to have a look at the lab who reported it, what references did they use. Some variants, we may have a lot of information on it and it's conflicting. Other variants might be so rare there's nothing. So if there's conflicting information, it's worth having a professional do a deep dive into the medical literature to see if there's anything else that can be done to help sort it out. If it's really rare, you might just have to wait for science to catch up with you. And we reassess all of our VUSs in 2 years at the patient's request. Not, we don't do it for everything in the clinic. We never see any new patients. And then sometimes if we're suspicious a variant is the answer and there's multiple living family members with aneurysms, we may be able to take samples from other family members to see if the variant is going with the disease. So if you have a first or second cousin that has orthopathy, you want to test the furthest related to you relative with orthopathy. If they don't have it, then it makes it less likely that it's the answer. If they do have it, you're supposed to have a certain percentage of your genes in common because you're blood relatives. So, but sometimes tracking VUSs through multiple family members can help clarify it. But we need a big family and multiple living affected people.
So really quite a bit of detective work that genetic counselors
lots of detective work.
And you, the patient, are not responsible for any of it. You should leave that to the professionals.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a really good question. I'm grateful to the person for asking it, because if they want to know, then lots of people want to know.
Yes, a good genetic counselor is the right place to start for ordering genetic testing. Yes.
Absolutely. And again, see the link on the page for how to find one using those directories. You can ask your doc, if you have a primary care doctor, you can ask he or she as well. They're a good resource. A lot of places. Okay, let's see. I think I have maybe one more, and then we're almost at the hour here. Let's see. This person says, I think they're asking about the difference between a panel, a thoracic aortic disease panel, and getting a single gene test. It sounds like maybe they had testing for Marfan syndrome. I'm not sure, the person didn't say, but one. So can you just talk about like panel versus single gene versus?
So you guys have Costco in the States, right? Or is it called Price Club down there? Okay.
Oh, we have Costco.
So, for the people who shop at Costco, try to go to Costco and buy one single can of like pop or soup or whatever. You can't do it. It comes in a package. That's kind of what genetic testing is like these days. So most genetic testing for orthopathy starts with what we call a panel of genes. So some labs use small targeted panels to specific aneurysm genes. Some labs offer huge panels that cover all connective tissue disorders, which may or may not have a risk for aneurysms with them. So doing a panel is like doing a fishing expedition to see if there's a genetic error amongst numerous genes. Targeted testing for one specific condition, say Marfan syndrome, is where you're looking at the one gene that causes Marfan syndrome. For Loeys-Dietz, there are more than one gene. We don't do targeted testing in our clinic any longer because there's so much overlap in the features of Marfan syndrome, Loeys-Dietz, and some of the other connective tissue disorders. We don't want to miss anything. So we recommend the first testing in the family start with a panel. Then, if a family member is found to have one genetic variant that's responsible for the orthopathy disease, that's when all the other family members can have targeted testing for that one specific gene change. Hopefully that makes sense, because we wouldn't expect two people with aneurysms from the same family to have a different genetic basis. If that makes sense, it should be the same because they're the same family. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, that reminds me, I had a question recently that I think, well, maybe it'll be our last one because we're at the hour here, where someone said, you know, I think it was their sibling has this pathogenic variant in X gene. Myself or my other, should we get the full enchilada, the Costco size pack, or do we just need that
The corner store?
Yeah, if they have, you know, XYZ mutation or variant, is it possible we have ABC variant, or would we only worry about the XYZ?
Yeah. So if you have one family member with an aneurysm who has genetic testing, we found a disease causing or a pathogenic variant, then all family members can be tested for that one variant. The only time we would do two panels in a family is if the second family member had an aneurysm and not the same variant, like the variant in their brother or sister wasn't found. Then we would do a larger panel to make sure we are not missing a second disease in the family. Sometimes there can be rare circumstances, depending on the test methods used, where there can be something called a allele dropout and the family variant doesn't show up. I've personally never encountered that, but I had a colleague who did really recently. So rare, but it happens. So
yeah.
If the unexpected happens, do more testing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are at the hour here, so I know you're really busy, and I will let you go. But thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. There's a whole bunch of thank yous in the chat, so I think everybody learned a lot today. I learned something, so that's great too. And we're gonna post this, of course, on our YouTube, and you can share it with your friends and family. Rewatch it if you need to refresh, or some of it went by too fast. I know sometimes it's a lot to take in when maybe the last time you were really thinking about genetics was your P-squares and biology in high school. It can be quite a lot.
Yeah.
Andrea, you did a fabulous job of distilling it in a way that was really easy.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for tuning in. Have a great day.
Yeah, you as well. And then one last note is that next month, our speaker is Dr. Shireen Shaloub, who is a vascular surgeon, but she's going to be talking about the Aortic Dissection Collaborative, which is a new partnership we have, which is a patient-centered research collaborative. And then in September, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the John Ritter Research Program. I know a bunch of questions came up about that. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we've discovered so far, what we found, and where progress is happening. So thank you all for joining us today. And I hope that everyone learned something. Take care.